Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending today's performance class, part 133, performance class 3 implementation and operations webinar. My name's Kevin McMurtry. I'm a flying operations inspector and I work in a part of CASA called its operations implementation branch, which we predominantly manage transition processes to the flight operations regulations. The webinar, however, will be facilitated by one of CASA's rotorcraft subject matter experts who I'll introduce shortly. And I'll be taking over during the webinar at a later stage just to provide some information on the submission process and the transition process to the performance class or the performance class 3 requirements. The Part 133 rotorcraft performance class procedures are one of the regulatory provisions of the flight operations regulations that was deferred, and the reason it was deferred was to assist industry and CASA for a time to implement the procedures. So today's webinar provides you an overview of the Part 133 rotorcraft performance class procedures relevant to performance class 3. We're not looking at, or we're just going to do a very quick overview of performance class 1, 2 and 2 of exposure, but this particular webinar is focused on performance class 3 operations and also importantly how to submit your performance class 3 documentation to CASA, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Just some housekeeping. If everyone can just keep your microphones and cameras off during the actual presentation of the webinar, thanks. That saves bandwidth and also it's not as a distractor. If we can just leave, there's opportunity for questions at the end. So if you can, or you can place your questions in the chat if you like, but there is an opportunity at the end to ask questions. The session will be recorded and also importantly will be made available to you as a link that you'll receive that you can reference at a later date. So what I'll do now is, first of all, before we start moving on, acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people present here today. Next slide, please. So today's agenda for the webinar, welcome and introductions. I'll welcome Matt Wallace, the facilitator, shortly. Then an overview of the flight operations rules, then specifically performance class 3 requirements and examples. And then when Matt has completed those technical aspects of the presentation, I'll be taking over and I'll go over the transition dates and the submission process. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So what I'd like to do now is introduce you to Matt Wallace. Matt is a heavy helicopter senior standards officer at CASA and works in CASA's flight standards branch. And Matt will be facilitating and presenting the webinar today. So I'd like to now hand over to Matt to take you through the webinar. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And for those in Perth, good morning. I'd like to start by acknowledging everybody that made the effort to be here today. I do understand there's a lot of head of operations, HOPOs, etc. In the room and on the meeting, and that you're very busy and you've got a lot of things to do. So thank you so much for attending today. CASA sort of understands the workload associated post 2 December 21 with the flight ops regs. There's a significant amount of work. There's a significant amount of work associated with helicopter performance classes. So I really thank you so much for the work you've done today and for being here. There's a couple other people in the room I'd also just like to acknowledge. The first one is Dale South. Dale South, this is his baby. He's been working on this for probably close to 20 years now, and he's done a lot of work inside of CASA and with industry to have this come into effect. And he really is a centre of expertise on this. And of course, I'll be using Dale when we get to question times. Also, Deb Mainstone, she's a colleague in Flight Standards Branch, Heavy Helicopter. She'll be available to answer questions as well. Her background is basically everything from R22 mustering right through to heavy helicopter offshore out of East Timor. So significant experience there. And my background was military, heavy helicopters, police, SAR and EMS, but also time as a chief pilot for an operator, which was 22s, 44s, 206s and 350s. So I've got that sort of understanding of what this means, and a bit of an overview of Performance Class 3 and sort of used in the past as well. The intent today is to make the presentation as painless as possible. I just want to step through it short and sharp. Just cover the things we need to cover, but then get to the important part, which is a Q&A where you can sort of ask any questions. As we go through the presentation, if there's something you're a bit unsure of, just note it down and bring it up in the Q&A. If you're finding everything's just too fast and I'm stepping through it too fast, you can just put the hand up and I'll slow things down. But the intent is to step through it using the experience in the room, that we're covering the bits we need to, and getting to the Q&A. All right, so we know and love the date, 2 December 21, which is the commencement of the flight officer regulations. And some regulations had complex provisions that would defer, safety management systems, training and checking systems, etc. So they were deferred, as was performance class. So the next deferred provision to transition is the rotorcraft performance rules, and hence we're providing these webinars to give you an understanding of what needs to be done. Rotorcraft performance rules will manage the risk by ensuring that operators follow standardised procedures to address the risk of critical engine failure. And what we're talking about there is to say operators already manage risk. They've been doing this, forever. I was in the military when aviation risk management sort of come into play. And what it was more about implementing a documented thought process associated with the management of risk. So we understand that, hey, we're already managing risk, but this is a documented process around those risk procedures. Just breaking this down so we can step through the presentation. I'm just going to quickly cover the stages of flight associated with a performance class, and this applies across the board, and it's all sort of in as part of 133. So much of this you probably know already. So 133 requires a rotorcraft to be flying within one of the performance classes for any stages of the flight. And to ensure that we have a performance class with each stage, the stages are broken down. So takeoff and climb, en route, approach and landing, and the bulk landing. The only general exemption is a medical transport operation where the relevant stage of the flight is conducted to a medical transport operating site. Whole different set of rules, but all it's saying is going to a medical transport operating site, i.e. by the side of the road, you're exempt from the requirements of a performance class. In the arrangement of the stages of flight, the takeoff stage and the takeoff initial climb stage can be considered somewhat overlapping, in that the takeoff is obviously required after taxi. We have the takeoff manoeuvring up to the rotate point, and then we've got the takeoff and initial climb, which is a rotate point to 1,000 feet above the aerodrome level or your minimum height for the flight. So there's just a slight overlap between those two stages. Performance classes, we've got the 4, which is PC1, PC2, PC2 with exposure, and PC3. To get to PC3, I'm just going to quickly touch on 1, 2, and 2 with exposure. So when we talk about performance class 1, if we relate it to the the aeroplane side of the house, we're talking about something like a domestic flight. So we're saying, so in this case, performance class 1 is that in the event of a critical engine failure, performance is available to enable the helicopter to safely continue the flight to an appropriate landing area, unless the failure occurs prior to reaching TDP or after passing the LDP, landing decision point, in which case the helicopter must be able to land within the rejected takeoff or landing area. So all it's saying is that if I have an engine failure prior to TDP, I can import back onto the runway, and the same with the landing. After I'm committed, I can then actually use the runway as I haven't got to reject a sort of takeoff distance. PC2 varies slightly in terms of so that operations with performance such that in the event of a critical engine failure, performance is available to enable the helicopter to safely continue the flight to an appropriate landing area, except when the failure occurs during the takeoff manoeuvre or late in the landing manoeuvre, in which case a forced landing may be required. And when we talk about a forced landing, we're talking about a suitable forced landing. So in PC2, the rejected takeoff distance is not required, providing a landing after engine failure to a suitable forced landing area can be achieved. And this must be possible from the point before for a takeoff or after for a landing. A safe flyaway to PC1 standards cannot be conducted. The use of a suitable forced landing area in PC2 assumes that during the forced landing, normal aircraft limits may be exceeded, but there's a reasonable expectation of no injuries to persons in the rotorcraft or on the ground. And in terms of reasonableness, when nominating a forced landing area as suitable, operators and pilots should be able to justify the characteristics of that landing area that most likely impact forces will allow the expectation for the rotorcraft to remain upright and no injuries to the public occupants of the rotorcraft. And in those sort of terms, PC2, we talk about the egg and the egg carton. We're saying, hey, PC1, look after the egg and the carton. And in PC2, we're saying, well, you might break the carton or you might bend the aircraft slightly, but it should remain upright and you're not going to hurt anybody on the ground or in the aircraft. So that might be just undulating terrain in front of where you depart. It might have small shrubs, etc., etc. But saying, hey, it's not the best area. I can't use it as I would for PC1, but it's an area where if I bore back into that area, I expect that, yes, there might be some damage to the undercarriage, but everybody should be okay. And 2 with exposure, very similar to 2, except now we don't have that suitable forced landing area. So PC2 with exposure is a modified PC2, with the exception that the provision for a suitable forced landing area is not mandated while within the designated exposure period for the rotorcraft. Now, if you want to go to sleep at night, go and read about PC2 with exposure. There's a lot in it. But what it's saying is that we have an exposure period depending on the rotorcraft. So, for instance, an aircraft like an AW139, you might have an exposure period of up to 36 seconds. Some of the aircraft meet that. Whereas an older, when you talk about, say, something like the 355, or you're talking something like a 105, you might have a very short exposure period of 8 seconds or so. So it just depends on the rotorcraft. And hence the rotorcraft operates in that segment of a stage of flight with exposure. An exposure time is defined in 133 for a rotorcraft that is flying in still air, the period in which the rotorcraft with one engine inoperative may not be able to achieve a safe forced landing or continue the flight safely, hence exposure. Right, getting on to what we're here for today, which is all about PC3. And PC3 is the most extensively used of the performance classes. It applies to all single-engine helicopters and to multi-engine rotorcraft that are not operated in PC1, PC2, or PC2 with exposure. And that can be for a number of reasons. For instance, the 105 are not having Cat A supplement. So you might find, something like that, even though it's a multi-engine rotorcraft, it doesn't meet the requirements of 1, 2, or 2 with exposure. And operations in PC3 is performance such that in the event of an engine failure at any time during the flight, a forced landing will be required. Very obvious if you're operating a single engine helicopter. Onto the suitable forced landing area. Again, I'll step through this. There's a lot of information in the reg, the MOS, and also the guidance material. But broad terms, we're saying, hey, if we had to use the area, we think we could make it there, not damage ourselves or anybody on the ground. So the definition, area of ground is a suitable forced landing area for a rotorcraft. So this is all coming out of 133010. For a flight of a rotorcraft, the rotorcraft could make a forced landing in the air with a reasonable expectation that there be no injuries to persons in the rotorcraft or on the ground. And for an operator to determine that a suitable forced landing area, the following questions must be answered in the affirmative. So this is how we go about things. Well, would it meet that requirement? Is there a reasonable expectation the rotorcraft will be able to reach the area in the event of an engine failure or other land immediately? So that might be a gearbox malfunction, for instance, vibration, etc., or land as soon as possible, aircraft emerging, and examples there, transmission problem. When determining whether a landing area is a suitable forced landing area, is there a reasonable expectation that the landing area meets the suitable forced landing area requirements, i.e., for example, the sufficient size and surface conditions, and in the event of a landing, including an auto rotation, would there be no injuries to persons in the rotorcraft or on the ground or the water area? So if I was choosing to land inside the MCG on its grand final day, it probably wouldn't be a suitable forced landing area. In relation to selecting an area of water to be a suitable forced landing area, are the additional requirements of 0, 1, 0, 2, 3 and 4 met? And so what 2, 3 and 4 are simply saying is, if I'm going to use water, do I have either fixed or emergency flotation equipment? Again, the expectation, no injuries to the person in the rotorcraft or on the water. There's reasonable expectation the person in the rotorcraft would survive being in the water, i.e. if I'm out over the bay or out, a distance from land, that I'd be able to get rescued. And if the flight is a passenger transport operation or a medical transport operation, the water must be adjacent to land, adjacent to an offshore installation with search and rescue capabilities, or in a location set out in the operator's exposition that has search and rescue capabilities. And also the obvious one is what's the sea state at the time. So if I've got emergency flotation, am I going to be operating within the restrictions or the limitations of that emergency flotation equipment? So when can we use performance class 3? So what we're looking at with so performance class 3 is a maximum operational passenger seating configuration of less than 10, and it's VFR by day. So that's what we're looking for, or it's a cargo transport operation. So we can operate in PC3, but if the operator elects to, you can obviously use the other performance class as well, which is 1, 2, 2 with exposure. Again, like I said, cargo transport operations, and then any flight rules, we can use PC1, PC2, or PC2 with exposure. So PC3 is really limited to the MOC less than 10, VFR by day, or a cargo transport operation. So I'm going to just break down each of those stages. This is all coming out of the Part 133 MOS and Section 10, 41, 42, 43 and 44, okay? So I don't want to read out exactly what that says, but that's where we're getting this information from. Okay, PC3 requirements and procedures. PC3 takeoff, initial climb, en route and approach and landing performance can be summarised as the ability to meet set conditions of weather, light and flight rules, light, as in we're talking about daylight, day VFR, for which passenger transport in VFR by day. Supported by procedures to ensure the establishment of the following. So what we're looking for is the mass within flight manual limits for takeoff, departure, en route, arrival and landing, ensuring an all engines operating obstacle clearance, minimising time inside the avoid area of the high velocity envelope, and consideration of appropriate surfaces over which the operation is to be performed. So it's quite simple. We're doing this VFR by day, ensuring within the flight manual limits that we can actually clear the obstacles, which most of us do when we're flying, ensuring flight inside, we're outside the HV envelope, and then consideration of the surface that we're going to be operating over. So what I'm doing now is just breaking it down to each stage. Again, I'll try and keep this as painless as possible. So the rotorcraft takeoff weight must not exceed the maximum mentioned in the flight manual for the type of takeoff to be carried out. Again, fairly simple. So either IGE or OGE, and have enough additional power for the type of takeoff procedure to be used. So that's saying it's up to the operator to try and determine what would be a additional power, what would be suitable additional power. Some operators use, hey, I'll plan everything around max continuous power and have maximum takeoff power available, or I might plan to use maximum takeoff power and then have a margin there. So some is 97%, hover out of gain effect, etc. is just having a margin there to say I'm not using the maximum power available at all times for these types of departure. And I'll read through this once, but it comes up again and again for each of the stages. So you're remaining outside the avoid area of the HV envelope, which we all try to do. And it is necessary for the rotorcraft to enter the rotorcraft's avoid area of the HV envelope to avoid an accident or incident. And what that actually means, I was like, well, what does that mean? It means that if I didn't go in there, I'm just going to run straight into a tree or something else. You know, okay, so I'm avoiding that accident or incident, not remain inside that area for longer than the minimum period necessary to avoid the tree. So that's all that's saying there. If I've got to go in there because I'm surrounded by high trees, I'm going to inside the HV envelope, I'm going to clear the trees, and then I'm going to depart. If I didn't, I'd have an accident or incident. Okay, moving to the takeoff and initial climb stage. The rotorcraft must clear an obstacle, if any, under the flight path by at least the adequate vertical margin. And I'll talk about that a little bit further on. And that's sort of getting it out of the flight manual or the operator's exposition. And again, here we go again, remain outside the rotorcraft's avoid area. And if we need to go inside the HV envelope, to do so the minimum time necessary. Or if you're operating over a populous area and the requirements of 10.26 can be met, or not operating over a populous area, climb out to the minimum height for the flight, selected cruise level within flight manual limitations. So the question is then, what are the requirements of 10.26? All very exciting. I'll just find that for you. Okay. So this is the 133 MOS 1026. So what these requirements are, the rotorcraft must be flown in a way, must not be flown in a way that create a hazard to a person or property on the ground or water. So what was discussed before is flown in a way for the route for the flight, the time during the flight over the populous area in which a suitable forced landing area for the flight is not available is minimised. So again, we're saying if we don't have a suitable forced landing area, we're going to minimise the time over that area. And then we have particle detection systems. So chip detectors, main and tail, and then post 2 December 23 includes a flight deck caution. So again, very simple requirements there. So if we can meet those and operating over a populous area, all we need to do is climb out to the minimum height for the flight or the selected cruise level within flight manual limitations. There's a little bit in that slide, so if you do have any questions for it, just note them down, and we'll tackle them at when we get to question time. All right, and the rotorcraft must clear an obstacle, if any, under the flight path by at least the adequate vertical margin. So these are the margins we've seen in some of the flight manuals. For instance, the AW139 uses about 35 feet. There's 15 feet from the flight manual, and CAS at another 22, so I've got 35 feet. So there's something in the flight manual about, hey, if I'm flying a profile, what the margin of clearance from the obstacle will be. If it's not in the flight manual, then it's in the operator's exposition. So some of the operators are using 10 feet, some are using 20 feet, etc. That's where it goes back to the operator to determine what they deem is suitable as an adequate vertical margin. All right, what we're doing here is the considerations for flight over a populous area. So for flight over a populous area, the pilot in command must operate the rotorcraft to maximise availability of suitable forced landing areas. And this sort of ties in with 91055 of the CASARs, which also requires a pilot in command to ensure that the rotorcraft is operating in a manner that does not create a hazard to other aircraft, persons or property. So if saying there's some accountability, saying, well, I'm going to operate over a populous area, then I must do so in a manner that's not going to create a hazard to another aircraft, person on the ground or property. And the particle detection system we spoke about, which monitors the main and tail rotor transmission gearbox, and post 2 December 23 includes a flight deck caution indicator for each gearbox. If we're operating over a populous area and those conditions cannot be met and an engine becomes inoperative, Until the rotorcraft reaches the minimum safe height for the flight, the rotorcraft must clear an obstacle, if any, under the flight path to a suitable forced landing area for the flight by at least the adequate vertical margin, which we discussed, for the rotorcraft for the takeoff and initial climb stage of the flight. So if we're saying if we can't meet those conditions in 1026, then until we get established at our transit height, then we must have a suitable forced landing area that we can reach. And of course, remaining outside the HV envelope, or if we need to enter the HV envelope, doing that for the minimum time necessary. So those things we spoke about in 1026 in terms of the chip detectors, if you don't have that, you can still operate, but you must comply with this condition. PC3 en route is fairly simple. The weight of the rotorcraft must allow the rotorcraft with all engines operating to achieve the minimum flight altitude for each point in the en route stage of the flight. And the rotorcraft must be flown in a way that minimises the time during the en route stage of the flight in which a suitable forced landing area for the flight is not available. So that's just saying, looking at it, and we'll run through some examples of that. But we're saying we're just minimising the time where we don't have a suitable forced landing area in this instance. Guidance material. So there's plenty of guidance material on this. So this is part 133 MOS 10.26. And then we've also got the advisory circular 133.01, which sort of outlines a lot of information. So there's a specific section on PC3, which really sort of expands on this information that we're providing today. So the purpose of the 133 and the MOS is to permit air transport operations over the populous area using PC3 to occur without the availability of a suitable forced landing area, where the requirements of 1026 on the Part 133 MOS are met. So an aircraft is not considered to be creating a hazard simply by flying over a populous area in the course of navigation, provided the aircraft adheres to the prescribed distance and altitude. So that's Part 91 minimum heights, and the distances and general requirements mentioned in 1026 and sections 1042, 43 of the MOS are met. So they're the conditions we've already gone through, 1042 and 1043, we've covered 1026. So you can operate over a populous area, and there's the guidance material sort of say, gives you the information you need whilst doing so. The guidance material also, so the 133 guidance material for PC3 also covers, and this is at 8.3.5.2, it's plenty of information there, talks about the challenging terrain. So it's saying when operating over challenging terrain in areas where no or very few suitable forced landing areas are available to perform a safe forced landing, the operator's policy should outline operations are permitted if the result of the risk assessment shows that the level of risk is acceptable and that the identified controls and mitigators are properly applied. Okay, so it's saying, yes, you can operate over challenging terrain, very few or no suitable forced landing areas, as long as you're operating in line with the operator's procedures. And the operator may consider using a procedural requirement for predetermined routes with known landing areas or suitable forced landing areas that are based on previous reconnaissance or desktop reviews for the flight route. So this is saying if this is an area we continually operate over and it's a known route, then we can put that information into the database. These processes are obviously included in the exposition and aimed at establishing the flight crew members a generalised flight planning and operational concept, which minimises to the greatest extent possible exposure to the consequence of an engine failure and makes those potential landing areas readily identifiable. Again, it's just running through a common sense approach to it, saying, hey, if you're operating over this area all the time, get those procedures into, look what you're going to do and include those procedures in your operations manual and ensure that the pilots are compliant with that. All right, on to the last stage, which is the approach and landing, or the bulk landing stage. The rotorcraft landing weight must not exceed the maximum weight mentioned in the flight manual for the type of approach to be carried out, either in-ground effect or out-of-ground effect, and then obviously have enough additional power to conduct a bulk landing, all engines operating at any point of the approach and landing, and clear the obstacles. And again, meet the requirements of 1026 or be able to achieve a suitable forced landing in a populous area. So if we're not meeting the requirements of 1026, then we're saying what we'll be able to do instead of that is be able to reach a suitable forced landing area. And again, minimising our time, trying to avoid the HV envelope. If we need to go inside for the minimum time. All right, so just to summarise what we've gone through, so 133 PC3 does not require suitable forced landings to be available at all times for 133 ops. Require a suitable forced landing to be available at all times over a populous area, and that's subject to the conditions we spoke about. Require turbine engine rotorcraft for any specific operations in 133. And what I've included here is just a term, a reality check. So I've done a lot of work in PC2 with exposure on heavy helicopters. I knew it really well until I went and flew it. And so it was great to sort of have all the knowledge and the understanding of PC2 with exposure, but it's only when I went out and flew it, now I understand it a lot better, understand the practical application of it. So the reality check is designed to sort of say, well, that's great. There's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of quotes of regulations and policies, etc. But what does it actually mean? And this goes back to that when I discussed before about risk management. In terms of what is risk management? Risk management really is the thought process and the documentation of that thought process of risk. So we're saying, hey, we operate, and the example we're using, we do a scenic fly over the, from Moorabbin over the Melbourne Metro most days of the week. So we're going to have a look at that. We're going to identify the risks associated with that. We're going to say, well, is it acceptable? No. Can we put any control measures in? Yes. What are they? We put them in. And then we say, well, okay, that's going to give us a residual risk level. Is the residual risk level acceptable to us as an organisation? As in, are you talking about, the HOFO, the CEO, the pods? We go, hey, is this acceptable? And if it is, then we're putting that procedure, etc., into the operations manual. So the ops manual content then supports what we're doing. Training, is our training suitable? Like, for instance, if we're talking about operating over CBD all the time, and then we've nominated a couple of golf areas or football ovals as our suitable forced landing area, or do we back ourselves to be able to make that? So, for instance, I know a lot of the time doing autos, it'll be on the airfield, nice, big and flat. We're going to roll the throttle off when we sort of know we're going to make it. But flying along over a populous area and trying to make a precision auto to a footy oval, it's probably something I can be able to do. So is the training suitable for what we're planning to do? Plan routes, how are we going to use the plan routes? And that's great. If we know we're going somewhere, we're going to have all the information there as available. But our unplanned routes, well, how are we going to do that? Well, a lot of people using, the iPads or Romays or AirPlan, putting the route in. We can actually spend, a minute or so, have a looking at the route, have a look at the sat view of that route, and seeing about what are we going to do along that route. Our departures, a lot of the times we'd like to go this way because of noise avoidance. Well, is there a better way to depart from that area that is going to give us the best chance in case of an engine failure? And again, applying that same methodology to the en route and landing phase. So just sort of running over that is saying that we're actually starting to think about this. And again, you're operating aircraft, they are expensive, you have big operations with what you do. So a lot of this you would already do. But now it's just making sure that we've managed the risk, accepted the risk, and we've got that information in the ops manual, and there's training associated with that, and pilots know what they should be doing. So this example here is just a very simple example. It's in the 133 AC01, and it really just steps through all the information associated with the fly. It sort of starts off at Moorabbin, goes straight out to Creswell, up the coast, into Melbourne CBD and back to Moorabbin. So I've just put a couple of legs there. And this is just an example of a planned scenic flight. So obviously very different if it's going to be unplanned. You wouldn't have this much information in that sort of short period of time. But it's starting to look at it and saying, well, in Benevent Engine Bay, where would I go? What places are available? And so coming out of Moorabbin, there's obviously room around Moorabbin itself. It's getting less and less, of course, because they build more things there. But then there's a couple of sort of open golf courses along the way. So they're the sort of things you're pointing out to your pilots about, well, this is where you probably need to go. But in that example also, it's like, well, what height am I at? What sort of rate of descent am I expecting auto rotation? What chance do I actually have of making that area? So that's really important. That's where it comes back to training as well. And those precision autos to say, well, making sure that, yes, we've identified those areas, but there's a reality associated with being able to make the areas. Going a little bit further along, now we're starting to approach the CBD, and there's a lot there's a lot less sort of areas that are available, and so for some of it you may not have a suitable area to go to. But in this case, the area around the Docklands at the time this was done, there were some areas there, and also just south of the MCG, there's gardens, etc. Or if the aircraft's fitted with emergency floats, you now have the river itself. Again, depending on how busy the river is, but that can be used as a suitable forced landing area if the aircraft was fitted with either fixed or emergency floats. This is just an example of a risk management plan. It's not saying this is the only way to do things. This is a very standardised sort of a risk management profile. But all it's doing, as we discussed, is trying to identify the hazards, have a look at the consequence, or try and get to our sort of a risk level associated with that, looking at some controls we're going to put in play, and then looking at the residual risk. So in this case, I'll just go for the top line. Aircraft emergency occurs leading to a forced or immediate landing with no suitable forced landing area. The impact catastrophic if it happens, unlikely that it would happen. And so it's going to give us a risk level of, again, it's a subjective assessment of sitting as high. Do we accept that? No, we're going to put some treatments in place. Proposed flight route to be surveyed prior to undertaking revenue flights. Suitable forced landing area to be identified for each leg. A master map, which can be electronic or the normal sort of putting it up on the board, to be compiled, including the location of each identified suitable forced landing area. And we're going to have the pilots conduct a route check, prior to conducting revenue sort of raising flights, and show them where the suitable forced landing area is there. So they're just some risk mitigators that can be put in place. And what does that do? Well, the consequence is still the same, still catastrophic if it occurs, but the likelihood now has gone down from what we said unlikely down to rare, and pulled that risk level down to significant, which is about where the operator is sort of comfortable with operating. Now, the most important thing is to say for the operator, well, is that acceptable for you as an organisation? Do you accept that that's a reasonable level of risk to accept for the job you're doing? And if you ever sort of recall back to the Black Hawk sort of mid-air, the first thing I sort of really noted about that was the CEO was on TV saying, if I had known what they were out there doing, there's no way I would have authorised that flight. And that's what you don't want to see. And so what we're trying to say here is that at least being able to go through the process of thinking about the risks associated with what you're doing, which, most you have already done, most operators have done this, but do you actually have it documented? Because you're seeing the ATSB sort of investigations now. The first thing they'll start looking for is risk management plans. Well, why are you operating there? Or, not saying you shouldn't, but did you think about what would occur, and what was your plan if that incident actually happened? Like, what was your plan in place? So that's what it's talking about there, is to say we think about it, we put in the treatments, we get a residual level of risk, and then we have an authorisation process around that. So the emergency services world, you can see some of those, sectors once you put in weather, winching, night, etc., it sits up quite high, and then has to be acceptable to say, if we're going to go and do that, there needs to be a level of sort of responsibility and authority around that. So the residual risk level and the acceptance of that risk is a really important part of the risk management process. The requirements summary. So air transport, less than 10 seats, MOPC, or cargo transport operations, saying will be conducted in PC3, but it's saying can be conducted in PC3. A suitable forced landing area available and the safety of the people and the property are considered for the elements of the flight. Maximum flight time over a suitable forced landing area along the route where possible. And in the guidance material, it talks about, hey, if you can deviate and add less than sort of 5 minutes to the total flight time, that should be acceptable. A particle detection system is fitted for populous area operations, or you have a suitable forced landing area available. Flight planning and risk assessment and management procedures are included in your exposition. The exposition risk assessment and management procedures have been followed for the flight. The pilot is not fatigued, obviously, but is trained and competent in relevant aircraft, normal and non-normal and emergency procedures and drills. And for populous area operation, the pilot is trained in this case, precision auto-rotation descents to areas which may have limited suitable forced landing areas available. So if we're saying the risk management part of their controls is a pilot's going to be trained, then they'll need to be trained in being able to do what you think that they might be able to do. All right, moving on to the exposition content. I'm going to keep this really short and sharp. It's all in the 133 AC. So I'll just give you the reference for that, and the slideshows will be available to you. So the Part 133 MOS exposition content, and this is what the requirement is. So no different from any other requirements that you would have for your operation conducted at the moment. So weights within limits, and you're able to determine the following for the flight: suitable flight paths, clearance from obstacles, location of your forced landing areas, the en route obstacle clearance, the suitable flight path for the approach and landing and bulk approach, and then your bulk approach obstacle clearance requirements. So it applies to the rotorcraft is or will be used for a flight during a stage of flight in which performance class 3 over a populous area and a suitable forced landing is not available to the rotorcraft. So the risk assessment, management and procedures for flight over a populous area, and then details of training for the operators pilots in conducting the auto-rotative descents with the rotorcraft to limited access areas. So again, just going back to what I said before, we're just saying the pilot's trained appropriately for the conditions we're expecting. And so lastly is that the rotorcraft flyman doesn't have details that minimum clearance, so the adequate vertical margin. Then you have that distance outlined in your operator's exposition. All right, and then the most easiest and efficient way to create the exposition content. So we have the guidance material. So that's I'll just grab that there. So it's AC 13301 version of 4.0, it's performance class operations. And everything from section 8 onwards is all about PC3. And that information is really designed, you can sort of lift that and drop it straight into the relevant sections of the operations manual. So 13301 has general guidance material for performance classes and specific exposition guidance material for 1, 2, and 3 for your use. 13301 Annex B and its Appendix A specific guidance material on operations over populous areas, suitable forced landing areas, and sample risk assessment. So, and that's some of that information I showed you today. And then one Annex C, which is has got the content with the sample exposition that you can use to implement those requirements. So that B and C gives you the information you need to do that. There is also a 133 standard operations manual, which is in the process of being developed at the moment. But that is a complete operations manual, and it's not, and it will have the information associated with PC3. We just don't have a release date for that at the moment, but there's plenty of material you have to be able to lift and drop straight in your ops manual just relating to PC3. And again, obviously, if you use the expedition guidance material and AMC in these ACs, it just make sure that it is considered suitable. However, you just need to ensure it's in the appropriate section of the operations manual. And then the examples there are performance risk assessment, aircraft specific SOPs, and training and checking requirements. Rightio, I have spoken enough. I'll now hand over to Kev, and he'll just talk about the transition timelines.
Thanks, Matt. And for everyone's information, the AC 13301 and the two appendices, Appendix B and Appendix C, I've included in the chat for this webinar. You've got the links to those documents in there that you'll be able to access and view those at your own, in your own time. Next slide, please, Matt. So what I'd like to do now is talk about the transition dates. The submission window for all performance classes is now open, and it ends on the 31st of March 2025. So at any point in time from now up until the 31st of March 2025, you have time to develop your performance class 3 procedures or formalise those in your exposition and then submit them to CASA by the 31st of March 2025. The transition ends on the 1st of July 2025. What that means is just a timeline we have that where we're expecting all of these processes and manuals submitted to CASA, so we can commence processing those for each industry operator. Each operator will receive written communications from us relating to your submission status. Based upon when we've received it, you'll get an acknowledgement email. And then also, if there's any other things, if there's any more information we may require, you'll get additional communications. And then once the submission has been reviewed and you've provided all the relevant documentation, you'll receive communications about when you've effectively transitioned. What that means is that you're successfully transitioned to performance class 3 procedures, and acknowledging that you may be already doing these things now. However, they're being formalised in your exposition. Next slide. Thanks, Matt. Another click. And the next one. Okay, that's it, thanks. Okay, the submission process of what do you need to submit? So each performance class submission will comprise of 3 documents. The non-significant change notification form, which will complete with the relevant, or the CEO and their agent, or their agent signing that. A completed rotorcraft performance self-assessment worksheet, which will have a quick run through that document shortly. And then your rotorcraft performance exposition or operations manual content. As Matt mentioned before, you can utilise the sample exposition content that's being produced internally by our helicopter experts, and you can modify and adapt that to your own purposes for your own unique operations. So that's what a submission will entail, will be the non-significant change notification form, self-assessment worksheet, and your exposition content. Next slide. The self-assessment worksheet will be used for yourself to assess as a checklist that you have all of the required regulatory provisions for Performance Class 3 contained in your exposition or operations manual. I'll give you a web page shortly, and it's got instructions where you can download that. There's clear instructions on the worksheet of how to complete the worksheet, and then what you need to do in respect to Performance Class 3 and also general performance classes. Next slide, please. Thanks. So each worksheet contains a general performance class self-assessment section, and that it contains sections for Performance Class 1, 2 of exposure, and Performance Class 3. The only sections you need to complete for Performance Class 3 is the Performance Class General section, and then the Performance Class 3 section. So each worksheet contains a legislation reference of the particular regulation that's applicable to Performance Class 3, and then a compliance question that you read, and then you provide your manual reference of where where that's contained in your exposition or operations manual, and any other comments if necessary. You may have a particular compliance requirement in maybe more than one area, or in electronic form or something like that. It's important to make sure that you complete all sections that are relevant to you, because what will happen is that we'll contact you and request more information that's missing to ensure that you can successfully transition to the performance class provisions. Next slide, thanks. And the Performance Class 3 slide, again, as I said before, there's not a lot of information that you need to complete, and it's just referring to the particular section in your exposition or operations manual of where that process or procedure is, and any additional comments. And next slide. Once you've completed the self-assessment worksheet, the CEO or their agent, and what I mean by an agent, a person who is generally approved or authorised as a power of attorney, submits the document, the non-significant change notification form, the self-assessment worksheet, and the exposition content to us. It's important, we found during the training and checking systems submission process, which is using a similar process of self-assessment, that's very important for the key persons who are involved in developing these procedures complete this checklist as opposed to a more administrative person, because we're finding if the key persons like the head of flight operations or the CEO isn't the person involved in this process, it tends to result in a self-assessment process and submissions that require more time and effort to satisfy the transition requirements. Next slide. Thanks, Matt. So submissions could be sent. Now, you would have received by now a case number for your performance class procedures. That's your unique case number for your organisation. So any communications about your rotorcraft performance, if you can include that case number in the email header, so we can identify that particular information or request, and also important submission to your organisation. All submissions go to regservices@casa.gov.au, and that must include the notification form and signed declaration, the self-assessment worksheet, and the exposition content also. And once we've received that, you'll receive a acknowledgement of receipt, and if any other information is required. Next slide, please. As was mentioned by Matt earlier, we understand that you're likely performing these types of procedures now, Transition to Part 133 performance class means that you will formally document these procedures in your exposition or operations manual. So what we do, as soon as we receive your submission, we'll do a document check that the submission contains those 3 documents. There's the non-significant change notification form, your self-assessment worksheet is completed, the manual references will be cross-checked in the exposition, and then, as I mentioned before, if all of those 3 items are satisfactory, that will mean your transition is complete and you'll receive notice in writing to state that. Otherwise, if there's any more information required, we'll request that and then continue progressing the submission. Next slide, thanks, Matt. So what happens after transition to your performance class procedures? Well, to achieve the intended safety benefits of performance class procedures, implementation and compliance of all the requirements doesn't just stop at the document submission step. It's an ongoing process which involves CAS's surveillance section when we come and do routine or scheduled surveillance on your operation. And these things will be further looked at and scoped in scheduled surveillance. Things that will be examined and scoped in surveillance with performance class procedures are contained in the exposition, and also maybe some sampling of performance class flights, training and competency checking procedures for flight crew that perform performance class flights, and also any risk assessment procedures, for example, risk assessments for suitable force landing availability, and also flight over populous areas in the areas that you operate. SMS reporting, hazard identification and risk assessment procedures for those who have already transitioned to the safety management system requirements. There's only a small handful of operators, of air transport operators, who've done that. However, if you have transitioned to SMS, Part 119 SMS, that would be also things that we would look at. And if you're incorporating any of these risk assessments and so forth in your SMS processes. Next slide, thanks, Matt. We understand that this is a predominantly performance class 3 webinar, but if there are any operators who are also maybe considering other performance classes, and you do need some specific guidance or questions on a performance class 1, 2, or 2 of exposure question or submission, you can contact us at the email on your screen. It's for.transition.support@casa.gov.au. Include your case number and your specific question with as much detail as possible, and then we will direct that to a subject matter expert who can assist you with your inquiry. And of course, that's also relevant for performance class 3. If there's something that you need, that you're really unsure of, and you need some help and guidance, you can also utilise that email address, and we'll endeavour to assist as much as we can. And the next slide, Matt, is questions. That's all from me. So if anyone has got any questions, please.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, it's Sam Borg here from United Aero Helicopters. The FOR transition case number that you said that everybody's got, I don't think we have a copy of that I can find. I've got FOR transition numbers for SMSs and training and checking systems, but was that sent out already?
No, Sam. Yeah, it was sent about three weeks ago from memory. I'll look into it. I'm familiar with your organisation. I'll look into that for you. It's United Aero, isn't it?
That's right. Yep.
Okay, leave that with me.
Okay, thanks.
Brenton, you got your hand up, mate?
Yeah, g'day. Brenton Yorith, I'm from United Aero as well. Can you just jump back to slide 27? I just had a question about that slide that you talked about operations for PC3, operations for 133 being turbine helicopters. And we sort of skipped over that one quite quickly. I just wanted to, I might have misread it.
Sorry, mate. I'll get the.
That's just before that one, yeah. Yeah, last point there. Require turbine engine rotorcraft for any specific operations in part 133.
Okay, yeah. So performance class 3 does not require turbine aircraft for any specific operation in part 133.
Right, okay, yeah. I forget, I didn't say that does not. I sort of went through that slide quite quick. I didn't read the first part there. That's okay. Thank you.
Oh, no worries at all, Brendan. Yeah, look, I just can't imagine anything worse sitting through like 40-something slides. So I was trying to just touch on it. But good, so I do apologise there.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's just we jumped through it a bit quick. That's why I wrote the slide number down so we could come back and have a look at it. But thanks anyway.
No, very welcome. Okay. Any more for any more? We don't have any further questions. Always available at Flight Standards branch. My email is just matthew.wallace@casa.gov.au. Feel free to send an email, etc. We've got that email that was put as part of the slides. I believe the slides will be going out. So feel free at any point to reach out and sort of ask any questions. I know sometimes these environments with a large number of people in the room, that it's a bit hard to ask some of these questions. But if you do have any, we really are here to help. So back over to you, Kev.
Matt, there's just a question, one single question in the chat from Mike Watson.
Yep. And the question is?
Okay, so it's for Mike. When you say the aircraft must clear obstacles on takeoff and initial climb, do you mean with the engine operating, or do you mean also in the event of an engine failure?
So I can just go back to that. Look, it's outlined is to say that if we're meeting the requirements of 10.26, and I'll get Dale just to make sure that I'm saying the right thing here. If we meet the requirements of 10.26 and we're saying we do have our chip detectors, etc., on takeoff, what we're doing is making sure we miss the obstacles, which is fairly obvious. If we're saying we don't meet the requirements of 10.26, then what we're saying is because we don't meet those requirements, we're now requiring a suitable forced landing area. And the intent is to say that if you have an engine failure, you'll be able to miss the obstacles and make the suitable forced landing area. Again, it's sort of expanded in the AEC and the MOS. But does that answer the question? I'm very happy to take it if.
It's just that 10.26 also states in Part A that the pilot and command must operate to maximise the availability of suitable forced landing areas. So, what does that mean on takeoff and climb?
Dale, did you want to? Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but look, the basis of the requirement is to say, like, because 10.26 doesn't just apply to the takeoff phase, but what it is saying is that during that takeoff phase, if I don't meet the requirements of 10.26 during that phase, then, and really the main one we're talking about there is the a chip detector for the transmission and the caution line, is to say that in the event of an engine failure, how I'm mitigating that risk now is I'm going to have a suitable forced landing area for the takeoff and initial climb, and saying if I have an engine failure during that phase, then I'll be able to miss the obstacles and actually make that suitable forced landing area. Does that answer that, Michael, or does you need more information on that one?
I just find it very contradictory because you're saying if you meet the 1026, you don't have to, but I can't see how it's possible to comply with 1026.
All right, I'll just bounce it to Dale, and if you could take it, Dale, that'd be great.
Yeah, the compliance requirement in the MOS is performance-based. Therefore, to actually understand it, you have to read the head of power, which is Regulation 133340. Regulation 133340 talks about doing things when suitable forced landing areas are not available. So the provision in the MOS cannot disagree with the regulation that it's head of power. So therefore, what it's basically saying is when suitable forced landing areas are not available, or when you're operating in an area where suitable forced landing areas are very sparsely available, the pilot, when conducting those operations, has to comply with the MOS. And the MOS says, let's, in this situation, maximise those that are available, but if there are none, because the head of power talks about no suitable forced landing areas being available, we can still operate. So all the performance provisions doing in Para A is effectively saying, if there are ones around, operate so you're maximising their availability. If there aren't any around, the head of power says you can still operate, providing you continue to comply with the MOS. And the effective compliance criteria is the particle detection systems and the cockpit cautions. Is that more helpful?
Yeah, kind of. I still can't get past the requirement that you can't operate in a manner that does not create a hazard to aircraft, person, or property.
That's a Part 91 requirement for the operation of any aircraft, and it's a PIC requirement for any operation. Part 133, 135, 121, 91, or 138. It's an effective repeat of a previous provision we had in CAR 88 about not creating a hazard, which is it's a difficult piece of legislation to prove an offence against, but it's a general requirement, and it's often in most NAA's general operating rules. For example, they have it in the FAA FARs as well in Part 91.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
And Mike, if you need to, you can just send me an email, and I'm happy to set up another meeting, and we can just go through in further detail.
Thank you.
No worries, mate. Thanks, Dale. Any more for any more? Over to you, Kev, to wrap it up.
Well, thanks for that, everyone. I appreciate attending today in this interesting webinar that Matt presented, and we appreciate the time that you've taken out of your day to attend this. And as we mentioned before, if you do need any help on something or any clarification, don't hesitate to contact us. And just use that 4-dot transition. Actually, I'll put it in the chat for you now. And that way we can, if you've got any specific questions, we can help to address them for you. Once again, thanks for your time today, and we wish you the best for the afternoon. Thank you for attending.